The dark waters of the river conceal a history written in fear and silence. Centuries ago, this gentle stream became the ultimate judge for a desperate, terrified community. We look back upon an ancient practice known as the water ordeal. It was a brutal test designed to extract truth from the depths of superstition and paranoia. In a small, isolated village, shadows stretched long across the valley. The people lived under the constant threat of disease, famine, and unseen malevolent supernatural forces around them. They needed someone to blame for their ruined harvests and sudden illnesses. Their collective gaze eventually fell upon a young woman who lived alone near the dark woods. Her name was forgotten by the official records, but local legends remember her simply as Eleanor. She gathered wild herbs and kept quietly to her own peaceful business. Independence was a dangerous trait for a woman during those unforgiving times. Suspicion grew like a toxic weed, choking the reason and compassion of her suspicious, wary neighbors. Whispers echoed through the narrow market. They claimed she danced with dark demons under the pale moonlight and cursed the local cattle to suffer sudden and agonizing deaths. The village elders convened in the dim candlelight of the old stone hall. They decided that a trial was absolutely necessary to cleanse their tainted, terrified community forever. Traditional justice required evidence, but fear demanded an immediate and visible spectacle. They chose the ordeal of water, a method rooted deeply in blind, archaic religious fanatical beliefs. The twisted logic was simple, yet profoundly cruel. Pure water would allegedly reject a servant of evil, causing the guilty party to unnaturally float upon the cold surface. Conversely, if the accused woman sank into the deep, murky depths, she was deemed entirely innocent. However, this innocence almost always came at the ultimate fatal human price. Eleanor was dragged from her small wooden cottage at the break of dawn. The morning mist clung tightly to the damp ground like a heavy gray burial shroud. Her neighbors, people she had known and helped for many years, now stared at her with blank, unfeeling eyes filled with cold, irrational hatred and deep, misplaced terror. The procession marched slowly toward the rushing river. The steady beating of a single leather drum echoed through the quiet forest, sealing her grim and tragic final destiny. Birds fell silent as the large crowd approached the muddy banks. The atmosphere was thick with morbid anticipation and an unsettling sense of strict, self-righteous, absolute duty. They bound her right thumb to her left toe and her left thumb to her right toe. This specific knot was believed to prevent dark magical escapes entirely. Heavy ropes dug sharply into her pale, fragile skin. She offered no resistance, knowing that any physical struggle would only be seen as absolute proof of demonic possession. The village priest stood upon a large, smooth stone near the cold water. He raised his worn wooden cross high to bless this brutal and unjust earthly proceeding. He shouted loud prayers into the freezing wind, calling upon the heavens to reveal the hidden truth. His voice trembled, betraying a secret underlying sliver of human doubt. Two strong men lifted Eleanor by the thick, coarse ropes. They swung her tied body back and forth, building enough powerful momentum to throw her far outward cleanly. The dark river waited patiently below. It was an impartial natural force, indifferent to the petty fears and the fatal foolishness of the mortal humans standing above it. With a sudden loud splash, she hit the freezing water. The surface broke, sending heavy ripples outward toward the muddy banks, where her silent accusers carefully watched her. For a brief, terrifying moment, she bobbed near the surface. The crowd collectively gasped, pointing their fingers, convinced that the dark water was actively rejecting her sinful soul. But heavy wool clothing quickly absorbs liquid. The trapped air escaped from the dense fabric, and the unforgiving weight began pulling her downward into the dark, icy abyss. Down she went, vanishing beneath the turbulent gray waves. The river swallowed her completely, leaving behind only a smooth, unbroken surface that hid the ongoing, silent, deadly struggle. According to the horrific rules of the water ordeal, her sinking was definitive evidence of her complete innocence. The water had successfully embraced her pure, righteous, unblemished spirit. The men scrambled to pull the recovery ropes attached to her waist. They heaved against the fierce underwater current, desperately trying to retrieve the newly vindicated innocent woman. However, panic and clumsy hands caused a fatal, tragic delay. The ropes snagged tightly on sharp submerged rocks, keeping her pinned deep below the cold, rushing, suffocating water. Minutes felt like an eternity as the frantic men struggled. The priest fell to his bruised knees, praying frantically for the safe return of the poor vindicated captive. By the time they finally dragged her limp body back onto the muddy riverbank, it was already far too late. Her chest remained completely still and utterly lifeless. The crowd stared in absolute stunned silence. They had successfully proven her purity, but their cruel method had abruptly extinguished the fragile life they sought to unfairly judge. Water dripped slowly from her long, tangled hair, The bindings on her fingers and toes were hastily cut away, leaving deep purple bruises on her cold, pale skin. The village had found the absolute truth they desperately wanted. Yet, gazing upon the tragic, lifeless outcome, nobody felt safer from the dark shadows haunting their miserable community. Their collective guilt instantly replaced their previous fear. They silently carried her broken body back through the dense woods, unable to look each other in the ashamed eyes. Eleanor was hastily buried in the sacred churchyard, a solemn privilege strictly reserved only for the pure and the undeniably innocent members of the deeply religious local flock. A simple, unmarked wooden cross was placed above her fresh, damp grave. It stood as a quiet, tragic testament to a horrific systemic failure of primitive blind justice. Following her tragic death, the mysterious crop blights continued anyway. The fatal illnesses still claimed their weak, vulnerable victims, proving her absolute innocence beyond any rational human doubt. The villagers eventually realized their massive, deadly mistake. They had ruthlessly murdered a kind, innocent neighbor, simply to temporarily satisfy their own uncontrollable wild superstitions and profound paranoia. Historical archives from the early 20th century show us haunting, reconstructed photographs of these bizarre, cruel practices, attempting to document human history and its profoundly irrational dark impulses. We stare at these sepia-toned images today with morbid fascination. They serve as a bleak visual reminder of what happens when blind fear eclipses basic human compassion. The water ordeal was not merely an isolated historical accident. It was a highly institutionalized, systemic method of psychological control wrapped heavily in strict, pious, religious legal doctrine. Authorities utilized this theatrical, fatal spectacle to maintain strict order. By focusing public anger onto vulnerable, marginalized scapegoats, they cleverly distracted everyone from actual systemic societal governance failures. This horrifying ritual operated on a paradox. If you survive, you are guilty and executed. If you drown, you are innocent but dead. There was no true escape. It perfectly illustrates the absolute futility of fighting against a rigged, corrupt system. The accused were doomed the very moment their paranoid neighbors pointed a shaky, accusing finger. Her tragic fate perfectly mirrors countless other lost, forgotten souls. Across different centuries and vast continents, marginalized people were repeatedly sacrificed to appease terrifying anxieties of the majority. The cold river remains unchanged today. It continues flowing quietly over those same smooth, ancient stones, keeping the deep, dark, silent secrets of the distant, tragic, unforgotten past. Sometimes, locals swear they can still hear a faint, weeping sound near the muddy banks. They quickly dismiss it as just the wind rustling through the dead branches. But history has a very long and stubborn memory. The ground remembers the heavy footsteps of the cruel mob, and the cold water remembers the innocent sinking body. Through photographic historical reconstruction, we forcibly drag these uncomfortable buried truths back into the harsh light. We owe these victims the dignity of our absolute, undivided modern attention. We carefully examine the frightened faces of the recreated villagers in these old pictures. We look for signs of remorse, but mostly we just find blank, obedient conformity. It is dangerously easy to blindly follow a terrified crowd. Standing alone against the overwhelming tide of public panic requires a rare and incredibly exceptional, strong personal bravery. None of her old friends possessed that vital courage. They chose the comfortable safety of the majority, allowing an innocent woman to perish in the freezing, merciless depths. The tragic irony remains incredibly sharp. In their desperate quest to violently destroy supposed evil, the paranoid villagers actually became the true monsters of this dark, terrible narrative. They let wild superstition drown their basic humanity. The ordeal of water did not cleanse their community. It permanently stained their local legacy with innocent red human blood. Today, our modern justice systems are built upon the strict foundational promise of concrete evidence and rational fair trials. We reject the barbaric theatrical ordeals of the past. However, the dark underlying human instinct to suddenly scapegoat others during times of severe crisis has never truly vanished from our complex and fragile global psychological social landscape. We must remain constantly vigilant against the rising tides of mass hysteria. Fear is a powerful, highly contagious poison that quickly rots the foundational pillars of rational justice. Let the somber story of the drowned captive be a lasting warning. Whenever a terrified society demands swift, unthinking vengeance, absolute tragedy is always the only guaranteed outcome. The dark river flows onward into the deep unknown. It carries the heavy, silent weight of countless untold historical tragedies, slowly washing away the forgotten ancient mortal sins. We close these dusty visual archives now. We leave her memory resting peacefully in the silent deep, hoping that humanity never resurrects such profoundly cruel, ignorant, dark practices.